My robot 2.0 has been programmed to guide you on your quest.
I've found an expert for the time trippers to interview. This week they will be speaking to Tom Hopkins. Tom Hopkins, famous museum curator, featured on Bargain Hunt and the news. Perhaps he will teach the time trippers a thing or two about flight.
All right, 2.0, we're coming. Pile in. Yeah, we'll have to use your, you'll have to promote us would you like to promote us on your Twitter?
I'd need to get a sense of the content, first of all, and make sure it's...
Yeah, no, fair enough.
It's like a 12A.
Yeah.
12A rating.
That should be okay.
We wouldn't put anything out if you didn't want us to, obviously. Mm-hmm. We're wise and respectful people now.
No, of course.
It's been far too long.
Yeah.
No, it really has.
Flight. So Tom, we did an episode on the Wright brothers and flight in general. So we had lots of questions we wanted to ask you from that, which we'll ask you later because they're pretty irrelevant and random. But
okay.
Would you like to start by telling us who you are and where you're from?
So I'm Tom Hopkins. I'm a curator of aircraft and exhibits at the Royal Air Force Museum. I'm originally from Reigate in Surrey.
Can you tell us a little more about Reigate in Surrey, please?
Reigate is a historic market town at the foot of the North Downs. It's a very charming place. Many people disparage it incorrectly by claiming it's just a sleepy commuter town, but it's got a very vibrant life of its own, steeped in history as well. The lovely castle, of which there are very little remnants, save for the impressive motte, which has some interesting caves underneath it, the Baron's Caves, where legend has it that the conspiring barons during the reign of King John met before forcing him to sign Magna Carta. But the truth of that is probably less exciting, and it never happened.
Does Reigate have any aeronautical history to it?
Good question.
You can include Red Hill.
That really does widen the net then. Not particularly. Perhaps the most notable feature is there was a crash of a B-17 on top of Reigate Hill. Don't really know the facts about that. Soz. Surrey in general though, yeah, really great sort of aeronautical heritage going on there. So Sopwith. I
know that name.
Yep. You may have heard of the Sopwith Camel, one of the most important British fighters from the First World War. Along with a whole range of sort of biplane aircraft. They were based in Kingston upon Thames, as were Hawker. Hawker are most famous for building the Hawker Hurricane, which together with the Spitfire was one of the main workforces of the RAF's fighter command during the Battle of Britain. And in fact, it's a lot more important than the Spitfire. The Hurricane was responsible for shooting down more enemy aircraft than all other British air defences combined. So that's including Spitfires, other fighter aircraft available, and ground-based anti-aircraft.
But are many... sorry to interrupt, Tom. Thank you for that. Are many of the available aircraft of that era playable planes on Microsoft Flight Simulator? No.
Microsoft in the late 90s released Microsoft Combat Flight Simulator.
Oh right,
and that had it was pretty good. I mean, the graphics obviously look quite clunky now, but a number of campaigns, so you could fly Hurricanes and early variant Spitfires during the Battle of Britain. You could fly American aircraft such as P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs on missions escorting American daylight bombing raids over the Third Reich. And you could play as the Germans as well. You could take to the skies in Messerschmitt Bf-109s or Focke-Wulf FW-190s.
I've got a quote for you, Tom.
Yep.
God denied to men the faculty of flight so that they might lead a quiet and tranquil life, for if they knew how to fly, they would always be in perpetual danger. Do you think flying is a dangerous pastime?
I think that's a good question, and it sort of largely depends on the context. I mean, many people are terrified of flying, and quite rightfully, if you think about the consequences of something going wrong. You're not exactly in a parachute, but statistics show that that flying in a modern jet airliner is far safer than driving in a car. So in that regard, no, statistically, you're going to be very safe. Of course, it wasn't always like that. The safety protocols they have in civil aviation are really born from a long series of aviation disasters and learning from mistakes. But of course, that's really just flying during peacetime conditions. Flying during wartime conditions has all sorts of associated hazards. And of course, being on the ground as well, and facing enemy aircraft, either if you're, for instance, say you're a combatant fighting with the army on the ground, and the enemy have got effective close air support, which they call in. It means you not only have to worry about what's in front of you, but also what's above you, and of course the civilian experience of being subject to bombing, which is very indiscriminate.
History repeats itself. History repeats itself. History repeats itself. First as a tragedy, then as a farce. Repeats itself.
You mentioned the military. Obviously, planes were really prominent in military aspects. But do you know when planes were first weaponized? How soon after the Wright brothers took to the skies did it take before the military came along and said, well, we're going to turn these into weapons?
It didn't take long. It really didn't take long. I don't have the date for when the British first started getting flying military machines, but I know that they were used in combat before the First World War, during possibly the Third Balkan War. I would need to fact check that, but that's going back to sort of 1911, 1912. First World War breaks out, and the both sides are mainly using aircraft for artillery spotting. So that's flying up in the sky, having a look to see where your artillery shells from your ground-based artillery batteries are landing, and then radioing in corrections so that they actually hit the enemy placements that you want them to. How air-to-air combat emerged is subject to conjecture. I've heard a rumour that it all began with an Australian officer who decided to throw a brick at a German pilot. I don't know if that's true or not. But certainly the first engagements were with pilots of the differing sides, taking their revolvers up with them and having pot shots, whilst also trying to man the controls of these rather flimsy machines. But quite soon they started fitting them with machine guns, and that changed everything.
They should have really just fitted them with like brick firers, so that you could, rather than throw the bricks, like launch the bricks through some rubber band contraption.
like invent the gun, but with bricks instead of
Yeah.
bullets.
That they could have done that, but if you think about a brick, it's quite heavy. I mean, I don't know how much a brick weighs, but probably getting on for like 500 grams to
They
a
could have
kilogram.
used breeze blocks. They're a bit lighter.
They are lighter but bigger, so they're going to take up a lot of space. Whereas you think about an ammunition round made from lead, predominantly with a brass casing and a small explosive charge, the penetration and lethality that you're going to get from something that weighs 10 to 20 grams is going to be far greater than a brick. Not to mention, increased range, accuracy, and penetration. So I think probably that's why they settled on using firearms rather than bricks.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Johnny had some other questions and observations when we did the flight episode. He was very pleased to ask me about the myth of Icarus, and then saying the reason that it probably isn't true is because the sun wouldn't have melted the wax, but rather that it would have been frozen because of the very high altitude.
That's pretty much true. As you get higher, there is less atmosphere to provide protection from the sun's rays, and especially aspects like UV. But the effect that you have with temperature inversion with altitude kind of does outstrip that, really, until you're actually much closer to the sun. And I'm not sure really if Icarus would have managed that with his waxy wings.
Do you have? Yeah, sorry, Tom, to interrupt you, but do you have a favourite mythical flyer?
I go for the Aquilla machine. It's a BBC TV children's TV drama series from the mid 1990s, where two boys on the summer holidays discover a Roman flying machine.
What's it called?
Aquilla.
Double Q.
Aquilla, which is the Latin word for eagle, of course. But they discover this thing underground. It's not actually Roman. I believe it comes from an older extraterrestrial civilization, but the last person to operate it was a Roman, so all of the controls were set in Latin. So they had to learn Latin pretty quick.
It was a good one. I'd recommend digging out some clips of it.
I've got some images.
Yeah, if we go into extraterrestrial flight and UFOs, we're going to open up a whole can of worms. So
Was is lost. We are time tripping, for I can see what is to come. We are time tripping. Much that once was is lost. Go back, learn the lessons. It is the only way to avoid catastrophe.
Let's just take it back further in human history. When do you think humans first started thinking about flight?
I think probably from the very first moment a human saw a bird gracefully drifting through the air, with that apparent sense of easiness that they're not having to frantically flap away. They're just cruising, and the sense of liberation that you can easily imagine, I think, that bird having and wanting to do the same, but realizing that we are stuck on the ground with all of the responsibilities that comes from. But that yearning, I think there's something very primordial about it.
Do you think a caveman would have ever attempted flight?
This is an important question because Johnny and I both had different views on this. So I'm hanging on your every word.
I think it's possible. Yeah, I think they would have observed the form of a bird and maybe tried to recreate that, much like Icarus, but it just wouldn't have worked.
No, we came to the conclusion they just didn't have the technology at that point. They'd only really mastered fire quite recently.
Yeah, I mean,
to
make it work, you need to make a wing that's got an aerofoil section. That requires like relatively advanced carpentry skills.
Well, I thought that a caveman would probably have like jumped off something like fairly nothing too high. I think still even an early caveman wouldn't have just jumped off a cliff necessarily while sober. But Johnny reckoned that they would have done, and that would have fed into the evolution of the caveman. Yeah. Anyway, it's a long day.
Cavemen did have heavier bones than humans do nowadays.
Interesting fact.
What's your point?
Evolution. Maybe they evolved lighter bones over time through this yearning to fly.
I don't think they evolved.
A counterpoint is we don't have any cave paintings of the first cavemen attempts at flight. There are no record of them on the walls of caves. But then again, you can count the number of cave paintings on one hand, maybe two.
If the bones of humans are lighter than those of cavemen, though, does that suggest that we're on a sort of trajectory where we will have hollow bones like birds, and maybe our fingers will grow to great lengths and will develop webs of skin between them and be able to flap around?
I mean, it's a hypothetical question, of course, but maybe if it wasn't for the Wright brothers, yes. I think the Wright brothers, they set us on a different course with their invention.
So they actually disrupted the evolution of human physiology.
In a way.
Your words, not mine. The expert. 1783, we have the invention of the balloon with Joseph and Jacques Montgolfier. Do you like balloons, Tom, or just planes?
I don't like balloons. No, they're kind of slow and bulbous. There's nothing elegant about them at all.
They're dangerous, lumpen, and yeah. Dangerous.
Amusing contraptions for the easily amused.
Did you know that the first passengers in a balloon weren't human? They were a cockerel, a sheep, and a duck. The first passengers to go up in it went up to 6,000 feet.
That's quite interesting because that puts me in mind of early space programs. For instance, we all know Laika, the space dog. The Soviet propaganda machine went to great lengths to claim survived her flight into space, whereas she really didn't. And believe the Americans put a few monkeys into space.
Mm-hmm. Yep, true. Do you know what happened to the cockerel, sheep, and duck in the Montgolfier balloon? Did they survive or not?
I don't know. Do you?
No. Did Wilbur and Orville experiment with animals at all?
Not that I know of. I think the nature of their machine, where you need some sort of engine control, would mean that you'd have to have a relatively well-trained animal. I'm not sure if that's something that they thought about necessarily.
No, I think you're right there. It was pretty out of the blue. A question, I think that Johnny was being silly, to be honest.
It does make me think, though, is there any animal that you could ever train to operate a rudimentary flying machine?
Probably a chimp.
It doesn't sound safe for anyone on board.
It doesn't, but I think it's
cabin crew.
I mean, obviously, you test it with simulators, right?
Yeah, but I think probably those days are gone. What? Why?
So I was trying to escape somewhere with some chickens in a truck, and we were being pursued by several select baddies from the Game of Thrones franchise.
Do you have a favourite plane, Tom?
I know I always dread this question. I mean, it's a bit like what's your favourite child? I've always had a soft spot for the Bristol Beaufighter. So it's got a bit of a lineage to it. So in the early to mid 1930s, Bristol had this small civil airliner design, and it was relatively fast for its day. The Air Ministry sort of clocked onto that. We're like, well, let's adapt it to be a light bomber, and that sort of bore the Bristol Blenheim, one of the main fighter types that was deployed to France in 1940 before the fall of France, and used in bombing roles against German targets, and quickly proved to be pretty ineffective. It was slow, much slower than contemporary German fighters. It had a relatively weak defensive armament, and its bomb load was pretty paltry compared to bombers that came along later in the war. So the Blenheim was out as a bomber, but it was successfully adapted to be a night fighter, remove the bombs, give it a few extra machine guns, remove the gun turrets. It sort of held its own in that night fighter role. But they sort of kept on tweaking with that airframe. They're like, well, could it be deployed as a torpedo bomber? Yes, it could, with a few modifications. Then came along the Beaufort, and then from that we had the Beaufighter, which is an absolutely formidable beast. It's overlooked by the Mosquito, though, which fulfilled a similar role, but just had more elegant lines. Beauty sometimes does really trump everything else, as we see with the Spitfire, which is so frequently eclipsed by the Hurricane, when it's the Hurricane that really deserves the credit for being the real workhorse in the Battle of Britain.
Well, I can tell you're going to have a real field day, Tom, when we get to 1940. We'll have to get you back for that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I'd be
No spoilers!
No spoilers. Do you have a favourite aviator?
I've always enjoyed the film Hot Shots Part 2. So whoever Charlie Sheen's character is in that, I'd say he's my favourite.
Right, a fictional aviator. Fair enough. Me and Phil, we didn't know too much about the Wright brothers, but we came to love them after learning a little bit more about them. And we think they're good candidates for top aviators just because of what they did, how they pushed the state of the art forward.
They're not problematic at all or anything, are they?
No, not as far as we can tell.
Pretty liberal chaps.
Yeah, never got into any trouble, never married.
Johnny and
controls. That's about the worst thing that they have.
They never married.
They never married. No.
Johnny says they have had a bromance. A bromance.
With each other?
Yeah, but in a brotherly way, obviously. Like a traditional romance.
A traditional brotherly bromance.
Traditional brotherly bromance, because the one who died first, he was mourned terribly by the one who died second. Phil, who died first?
I did have the answer to this last time, but I don't know, Wilbur, Orville.
So when Wilbur died, Orville pretty much gave up his childhood passion of flying because it just wasn't the same again.
Okay, and that
he
was
didn't
because
he didn't have his brother to share it with, so it
that was
wasn't
because of
fun for him.
their bromance specifically, rather than the fact that they were just brothers.
Brotherly love, I would call it, rather than bromance. I think I picked the wrong word.
Okay.
But yeah, they had a strong brotherly bond.
Mm-hmm. Which flying museum do you work for? I've got written here as a question.
My museum doesn't fly; it's on the ground.
Lovely. Well, I'll leave my second question.
I work for the Royal Air Force Museum, Phil. We have we have 3 sites. 2 are open to the public, so we've got a site in Hendon in North London and the RAF Museum Midlands, which is next to RAF Cosford, halfway between Wolverhampton and Telford in Shropshire.
Lovely.
We're all working together to share fantastic stories and fantastic objects, and we want the public to enjoy the collections that we look after. That's the heart of museums, really.
I like that. Would you like to give your Twitter handle out?
So it's at TMP Hopkins 1.
I was thinking, Tom, have you heard of a concept called the Flying Doctors?
I have. Wasn't there an 80s TV show called The Flying Doctors?
There was an 80s TV show about quite a few things, but I think you're right, yes.
Yeah,
can you think of any other professions that could benefit from flying more?
I guess...
Oh, that was
Flying builders or flying accountants?
Have we lost Johnny?
Oh, yeah, he's dropped.
Oh, dear.
I think I cut out.
The Russians keep shelling his 5G mast. Yeah.
Well, hopefully I'm back for good now.
For the benefit of the listener, Johnny is based out in Poland, in Warsaw.
Well, don't dox me.
They'll home in their hypersonic missiles.
Just wait till we start talking about the Russians in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on drones? Do you like drones as a concept, or do you think planes should always be manned? Or
Drones frighten me, and I think there's almost like a loss of chivalry with a drone. The idea that you've got a guy with a nice silk scarf at the helms of a machine fighting for life and death versus somebody sat in a air-conditioned hut in Nevada with a joystick and a screen. But they're effective. They're very effective, and they save the lives of aircrew, which can only be a good thing.